Greetings all. So yesterday is another hat day, which means it is a bad hair day. But I'm here. So I wanted to do this video on codependency because I get a lot of questions about it and often people mistake what codependency really is, right? So a lot of times people think that codependency is clinginess, or they have this sort of this myth about what exactly codependency is. And so I wanted to try to break some of that down. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about signs of a codependent person, and then also what are the signs of a codependent relationship. So you can get your questions ready, so when I get ready to go to the questions portion, you can ask any questions. Hey Duncan, hey Poke Black. So let's get started. So I want to talk because there's a lot of stuff to cover. I have about 10 traits, but I really am going to try to stick to what I think are the most prominent symptoms of codependency. And so codependency in general is an unhealthy relationship pattern. And so my phone is just ringing, all kinds of things are happening. Codependency is an unhealthy relationship pattern where it's imbalanced, right? So that one person is generally carrying the emotional weight of the relationship over the other. And so let me talk about some of the traits of what it means to be codependent. So with codependency, we have the low self-esteem. Here's the very interesting thing about codependency, which we believe starts very early, that comes from an unreliable caretaker in the beginning of when we're young and we're growing up. And there might be someone who is not quite reliable and unavailable in ways. And it creates this dependency on identity and self-esteem with that particular caretaker. And then it sort of gets, replayed over and over. So let's talk about some of the traits of codependency. So like I said, there's low self-esteem. And the interesting thing about people who are dealing with codependency, they can mask it really well, right? So they disguise it because that's a coping skill, right? That they've learned over the years. So they look very confident on the outside sometimes, but underneath there's this deep sense of inadequacy. And oftentimes they feel like a fraud. They feel like a fraud to themselves because they present this mask to the world, but really there's this low self-esteem. The second thing is people pleasing. Oh my goodness. So this one is big. The people pleasing is a real big thing with codependency. So there's almost that inability to say no, the desire to put other people's needs over theirs as almost like a sacrifice. And sometimes they can be very frustrated about the people pleasing themselves, but just don't know how to say no. Hey Ivana, hey Kim. Which also folds very well into the third trait, which is weak or poor boundaries. So I'm going to say weak or poor boundaries because sometimes people think codependency means you have no boundaries, and that's not true. Oftentimes people with codependency vacillate between extremely rigid boundaries and then very poor boundaries. And so boundaries themselves are so that the line between one person's needs and your needs, or your thoughts, your feelings, and another person. When you're dealing with codependency, a lot of times that line is very blurry, and you can't quite make the difference between what is appropriately your side of the street and somebody else's side of the street. And so that's what weak or poor boundaries are. The fourth thing, and this is one thing that I really want people to get, and it's called reactivity. So where a person dealing with codependency can be very reactionary to other people's needs and wants and desires. So you may have heard this phrase before where, somebody else's crisis becomes your emergency. right? They're in high need, and so you're highly reactive to the other person's needs or desires. That's called reactivity, and that is very much a trait of the codependent. So that would be 4. 5 is caretaking to a fault, right? And this is the fixer. A lot of times, I've done videos and I've talked about this idea of overfunctioning, and people think that I mean overfunctioning is this idea of, you just do a lot of things. No, overfunctioning is when, you ever heard the saying where you have to stay on your side of the street? Overfunctioning is when you're doing your side of the street, the other person's side of the street. You're just doing all of the pieces. A lot of overfunctioners too will find themselves partnered or attracted to people or surrounded by people who are underfunctioners. So in that way, it's really, the pairing can be very triggering because, of course, you are over functioning because in your mind you're like, well, if I don't do it, they don't do it. And so that is really the idea of over functioning. So you become the fixer. You want to fix other people's problems. So that's number 5. That's the caretaking. 6 is control, which this really captures some of the caretaking very well because, codependents can be very controlling, a little bit bossy, right? Because if I think I'm a fixer and I'm an overfunctioner, then if you would just do what I say, your life would be better and so would mine, right? That's codependent control. The other piece to that control is that codependents generally feel a great deal of anxiety when they are in that loss of control. And because when things are happening with other people, they embody and absorb all of that angst and anxiety. So another thing, we're going to go with 7. 7 is dysfunctional communication. So what is that? That's the inability, hey Hazel, hey Alan, that the inability to really communicate your needs. Right? Sometimes you can encounter a person, and I might ask them, I might be working with a person in counseling, and I'm saying, we're talking, trying to help them identify their needs, and they don't know. They don't know because if you spend so much time focused on other people's needs, it's very challenging. It can be very challenging to even access your own needs. Greetings, Gina, Cynthia, Hazel. So that's number 7. Number 8 is problems with intimacy. So a lot of times codependents have a problem with intimacy, and it's not always, like I said, some of the misnomer is that, codependency is all about just being so clingy, and that's how you identify codependence. And that's not necessarily true, because sometimes the fear of judgment and rejection, or the fear of being smothered can lead codependent people to away from relationships, or even when they are, it's imbalance. See, part of being in a healthy relationship is reciprocity and mutuality. And so it's you give, I give, and you may be strong in one area and I'm strong in another area, and that becomes a balance. And this is important in the emotional environment too, is that there is balance in that, and that I feed you emotionally, you feed me emotionally, and that give and take and reciprocity is really important. But when someone is dealing with codependency, hey Sid, when someone is dealing with codependency, it can be very challenging to form those bonds of intimacy, because what feels like intimacy to codependents is actually, a lot of times, it's if they're able to be in that over functioning role where they're fixing, hey Jessica, hey Christian, then you are, that's what they think intimacy is, but it's not. And so that can be very distorted. Number 9 would be painful emotions. So a lot of codependency is dealing with anxiety and loneliness. And a lot of times you'll find people who are dealing with codependency have a underlying sense of lack of fulfillment. They just feel unfulfilled, not even able to really pinpoint the why. Like, I just don't feel fulfilled. Sometimes they can even have a lot going on in their life that others might identify as successful, but still undergirding that is this sense of not being fulfilled. And it can bring a lot of anxiety and depression. The other thing, number 10, would be denial. So codependents often deal with the denial that they are codependent, because if you're the fixer and the helper, then I'm not the problem. That's just me being loving. That's just me being caring, right? But it's out of balance. So again, because remember, codependency is about being out of balance in the relationship. And so there's a lot of denial. When you have the denial, it's very challenging to get the help and support that you need. The last one I want to focus on, the last trait, hey sunshine, is obsession. So a lot of codependents can be obsessed, very much obsessed with other people's needs or of making a mistake, so that perfectionism thing is a big part of codependency. So those are my 11 traits. I'm trying to condense them all so I get you in a small amount of time. But also I want to say that there's the element of, how do you know you're in a codependent relationship? Because that's the big one, right? That people often ask me, either about themselves or about friends that they may be watching. So a lot of times in the codependent relationship, you feel that sense of being trapped. Like no one, you have agency, you're aware you have agency, but you just feel emotionally trapped in the relationship. That's a sign you're in a codependent relationship. It can be that you will constantly feel on an emotional roller coaster. And part of it is, if one person is codependent and the other is an underfunctioner, a lot of the times that there's this sense of like, whatever, when they're up, we're up. When they're down, we're down. But that the relationship stasis is driven by the needs of the other person. Does that make sense? So we talk about that as an emotional roller coaster, and that can be a sign that this is a codependent relationship. When the emotional balance is not there, and that sense of needing the approval and positive judgment from the other person for a sense of identity and self-esteem, there's this running joke about like self-esteem is just that. It's the esteem you have for yourself. So a lot of times for people dealing with codependency, that's just not the case. A lot of their identity and value comes from other people, which brings us to the fact that a lot of people dealing with codependency can experience a lot of shame and guilt. And so that can become a big thing and very painful thing. So this is what codependency is. I wanted to make the video because, again, I get a lot of people who ask or talk about codependency in ways that isn't even really about codependency. So they'll say, oh, the person is clingy or they're enmeshed, so that makes them codependent. And that may or may not be the case, but that isn't always the case. Codependency is a different kind of relationship dynamic that can sometimes, the person who's codependent can appear very independent, actually. I mean, if you're the fixer and the helper and the caretaker, you can actually appear very independent. So this is what codependency is. Do you have any questions before I log off? You can go back, if you joined in the video in the middle, you can go back and look at some of the beginning of the conversation talking about the different traits. I went over 11 traits of codependency. So I want to say, of course, at the end, there is always hope. There is always hope to really get beyond codependency, because again, what is really healthy and fulfilling is to be in a relationship of balance, where there is a natural give and take, and you don't have to both have the same strengths, but you are supposed to be getting an emotional reciprocity and mutuality in your relationship. Okay, so if there are no questions, I'm going to let you go. and or comments. That's the other thing. You can just make a comment. If not, I am going to let you go. I hope you roll back, tag someone, or share the video privately with someone you think might be dealing with codependency, because there is a lot of help. I will tell you too, one of the things that puts you at the high risk for codependency is being an adult child of someone with an addiction like alcohol or addiction to drugs, and that becomes a high risk for codependency. And so there are great 12-step programs out there like Codependence Anonymous, that can be helpful, other kinds of support groups, and most definitely getting into some one-on-one talk therapy is really critical, because there is freedom and there is help, and there is a better way to manage relationships in a way that is personally fulfilling and fulfilling in the partnership. Okay, I wish you peace. I wish you love.